We're talking about market failures, and one prevalent type of market failure is non-excludable goods. What happens when you can't make customers pay? A market failure is a situation in which a market left to itself does not produce the most efficient allocation of resources. For this, we need to define the concept of excludability, the ability to prevent the consumption of a good. So you're familiar with excludable goods. Lunch is an excludable good. You know, if you don't pay for it, you don't get it. Medical treatment is excludable. The doctor can not give you an appointment and choose not to treat you. The theater is excludable. They check your ticket at the front door. Even some public parks are excludable. The excludability is not exercised. It is open to the public, and anybody can walk in and enjoy the grass and the trees. But some public parks actually have a fence around them and a gate that can be closed. So it is potentially excludable. But the ocean is not excludable. If you want to enjoy the ocean, go sailing, then there's nobody checking your pass or your ticket as you sail out into the ocean, perhaps to go fishing. Rivers and gullies too, because of their length, tend to be non-excludable. It's difficult to police those who have access to gullies and rivers. The sky is non-excludable. Anybody can look up. And some services, like public safety, is non-excludable. If a society, if a community is safe, it's pretty much safe for everybody in the community. So we can characterize goods and services and resources into those that are excludable and those that are non-excludable. Another useful concept is rivalry. The characteristic of a good such that its consumption in one instance removes the possibility of it being consumed again. Once again, you would think that all of the commodities that you know are rival. Lunch is rival. If you have it, then you can't have that same lunch again 1 hour later, or somebody else can't have it because you have eaten it. When you go to the doctor, if you have the 2 o'clock appointment, then nobody else can have the 2 o'clock appointment. Only one person can have the 2 o'clock appointment with each doctor. If you go fishing in the ocean, then the fish that you catch can't be simultaneously caught by somebody else. And if you occupy a part of a river or dump garbage in some part of a river or gully, then it takes up the space that somebody else can't occupy. But some goods and services are non-rival. If you're watching a movie in a movie theater, then somebody else can be watching exactly the same movie at the same time and getting just as much pleasure. By watching it, you're not using up any part of the movie experience. When you go to a park, several people can enjoy the park at the same time without diminishing the enjoyment of each other. Looking up at the sky, perhaps at a fireworks display, doesn't take away from the enjoyment of somebody else also looking at the fireworks display. And so too for public safety. Public safety is not limited such that its enjoyment by one person diminishes its enjoyment by another person. Those are all non-rival services. So between excludability and rivalry, we can identify 4 categories of goods and services. Those that are non-excludable create problems for markets operating on their own. Commodities that are non-excludable and rival are called common goods. And common goods suffer from what is called the tragedy of the commons. When no one can be excluded from accessing and consuming a good or a service or a resource, then it is used without constraint. If people can't be excluded, they can't be prevented from consuming it, from using it, and it has value. It is used without limit, and so it becomes depleted. It becomes depleted because it is rival and so can get used up. So if you imagine, a field at which all the neighboring cattle farmers have common access to for grazing, then all the cattle farmers allow their cows to graze in that field, and it becomes exhausted. After a while, it has no grass and it is barren. The tragedy of the commons. Non-excludable rival goods are used to exhaustion. This is why a community play field or an empty lot in a neighborhood often has no grass. The football or the cricket would be more enjoyable if it had some grass, but it ends up being overused to the point where the grass gets trampled. Tragedy of the commons. Harbors and rivers end up being polluted as an example of the tragedy of the commons. Everybody tosses their waste into it. Everybody has access to it, and it's finite. It's rival. It gets polluted. Climate change. The atmosphere is rival. It can get used up, but it's non-excludable. So the atmosphere around the planet ends up being a free dumping place for greenhouse gases. And that creates global warming. Climate change is an example on a global scale of the tragedy of the commons, unlimited access to a free rival resource. Gullies, where everybody tosses their garbage, becomes overused and blocked. Here's a paradox. This is the Western Pacific gray whale. It is an endangered species, threatened with extinction. But if I were to ask you, when was the last time you had fried whale, or a whale sandwich, or a barbecued whale? Well, nearly all of you could not identify when you have had any of that. But if I asked you when was the last time you had chicken, well, that probably was either dinner or lunch yesterday, on any day. It looks like we are eating chicken on a scale that we should have run out of chicken a long time ago. But chickens seem to have a secure future, and not whales. What's the difference? The difference is excludability. The habitat for the supply of whales is non-excludable. So whales are subject to overfishing, and because access to whales cannot be excluded, then there's no money to be made in growing whales. Here's the habitat of your, of your Kentucky Fried Chicken or any chicken supplier. Tends to have walls at all four sides, and the roof, it's excludable. Because it is excludable, then there's an incentive to produce chickens, and there's a limit on their use provided by the fact that you can be excluded from consuming them. Chickens are excludable. Pacific gray whales are not. The threatened extinction of whales is an example of the tragedy of the commons. So that's one category of non-excludable goods and the problem it creates, those that are rival. Those that are non-rival create a different problem. This is the problem of public goods. The problem with public goods is that it never gets used up, and they can't be excluded. So people have no incentive to pay for them. And if people have no incentive to pay for them, and they can't get used up, then a private business has no incentive to provide the goods. Which means the goods either don't get produced at all, the good or the service, or doesn't get produced in the quantity that it otherwise would be. Now, since these are goods and services that have value, if they are to be had at all, a government has to provide them. A public good is a good that is valued but will not be produced because in the nature of the good, it is non-rival and non-excludable, and therefore cannot be the subject, the object of a market transaction. Let's look at some examples. We mentioned public safety. Because public safety can be enjoyed freely by everybody, then you can't make money by providing public safety. You can make money by providing private safety, private security guards, but the freedom to walk down the street and not expect to be mugged is a part of public safety. And so no private business is going to provide that, not certainly as part of its business. Public health, that being safe and feeling safe from a virus pandemic is something that everyone enjoys equally. If some of us have a low likelihood of getting the virus because the prevalence of the virus is low, then all of us enjoy that. And one or two of us can't be excluded from it because we haven't paid our taxes. So public health is a public good and therefore is the responsibility of governments. Now, it would be great if it were the case that when you're trying to find your way somewhere and you come up on a road sign, tells you if you want to get to a Rockabessa, you keep driving straight. But if you hadn't paid all your taxes, then the sign becomes invisible to you. But road signs don't work that way. They're non-excludable. They're also non-rival. After you look at the sign and say, oh, Rockabessa is straight ahead, car coming behind you is not going to grumble, oh, well, the car in front has used up the sign, and now, I have no way of knowing where a Rockabessa is. It's non-rival. Sign is still there. It hasn't been used up. So road signage is a public good. And therefore, road signage is generally provided by governments. Street lighting, non-excludable and non-rival. Somebody walking down the street doesn't absorb the luminescence, and so there's less available for the person coming after him. Street lighting ends up being the responsibility of governments. But let's be clear on one thing. We have said that because of the nature of what is called public goods, governments have to provide them. Public health, public safety, road signs, and somewhat surprisingly, fireworks displays. Fireworks displays tend to be provided by city governments. Why would a fireworks display be something that a government does? That's because it's a public good. It's in the sky, so it's not rival. It doesn't get used up, and it's non-excludable. But you cannot conclude that merely because government provides it, it is therefore a public good. Governments, for various reasons, actually get quite involved in providing private goods, goods that are not definitionally public goods. Governments provide education. Governments provide medical care through public health clinics and public hospitals. And many governments provide transportation, public transportation that is subsidized. So don't think of public goods as merely what the government provides. Public goods are determined by the definition of being goods that are non-excludable and non-rival. And so governments ought to provide them if they are to be had at all. Which is why we say that the problem of public goods can be solved by, well, in two ways. One, by privatizing the good or service. So we say the atmosphere is non-excludable, and that is the problem with global warming, the problem that creates global warming. But we can actually privatize the atmosphere if we have a regulation that says that you're not able to emit carbon unless you have a permit. And then those permits can be tradable. Tradable carbon permits will reduce pollution, because now if you want to pollute the atmosphere with a greenhouse gas, you have to buy a permit to do so. And that's kind of a way of privatizing the atmosphere, of privatizing clean air. And that's going to solve that problem. But the main way that the public goods problem is solved is by the government providing it, by public provision. And that is why governments are responsible for public safety. That is why police forces tend to be state institutions. So we conclude that goods and services from which consumers cannot be excluded and are non-rival result in a breakdown of the private market, result in a market failure.